All right. Closing ceremony. We made it to the end of another incredible convention, and I got a lot out of this one. I'm not gonna lie; it's been one of my favorite conventions I think thus far. We still have some programs, as usual. We plug in this closing ceremony where we think the end is going to be, and then we're like, oh, we got this other important thing we need. Let's just throw it on the end, and then we end up extending the conference another 5 days. But this time it is only going to be a few more programs after this, and we'll close it off. But yeah, it's just been a pleasure just seeing everybody connecting, building that community. As much as this is a chance to skill build, to share information, to celebrate our activism and our successes, and to look forward to the future, to build more power. It's also a place to have that family reunion, to gather as a community, and that's what makes it worth doing, I think, in a lot of ways. Sometimes we come for the mission, and sometimes we need to come for our community. So here we are. We've got a guest speaker still coming up. We've got a drone panel after that that's going to be really good, and we've got a film, Medicating Normal, to close it out. So it's hard to ignore right now the situation that's happening and unfolding in Afghanistan. It's heartbreaking. I don't have time, and I don't know if I have the emotional ability to check the news right now. It's awful to see, and knowing that this is a result of U.S. militarism and imperialism and interference in that nation, and now the harm is coming to the Afghan people, and it's our fault. We've got to take some responsibility for that, and that's why our work is so important. Not only to stop current wars, but to prevent wars from happening. And we got to hold our government accountable. We've got to hold our leaders accountable. We've got to keep organizing. We've got to change this. So I want to bring up Cindy Peaster, who's been. I had the pleasure before this COVID-19 crisis started. Cindy and I spoke at UNLV in Vegas together about militarism and climate. And I remember walking through that campus, and students were handing out hand sanitizer and masks to people. They hadn't closed down the campus yet. We spoke in an empty auditorium because people were becoming afraid to gather already. The hotel was barren. The airports were empty. But Cindy had the courage to come out and speak with me there at the campus. And she's been influential on the work that we've done in Veterans for Peace around climate. She's been working on a lot of this all her life. It's put together some amazing slideshows. And it's through her connections that we have Neta Crawford, who's going to be able to speak to us. So I want Cindy to say a few words and do the official welcome for Anita. So Cindy, why don't you get your camera back on if you have your friend or family member there that's tech support to help you turn your camera back on and turn on the mic. We can get you up here, and you can say a few words and then introduce Nida.
Thank you for that, Garrett. I remember the trip to Las Vegas with a lot of appreciation for the students and their response, and for actually having some time with you. So I just want to say hello to everybody. It's really an honor to be able to introduce Neta Crawford. She's such a tremendous speaker and one we can all be proud of. So I'm glad you're all here to fully appreciate her contributions. We at Veterans for Peace are known as committed dissenters, protesting wars based on lies, brutal asymmetric wars, Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan, and as Garrett just mentioned, the fallout continues. Now, though, all of us find ourselves in the trenches in a battle we cannot afford to lose. The Department of Defense cannot defeat this enemy by bombing it into submission, even with nuclear weapons. That enemy, of course, is climate change, an enemy that is bringing the people of the world together in a desperate fight to avoid extinction. The hour is late, but thankfully we have a tremendous leader in this effort whose own research has led the way. Friends, today I'm deeply humbled and honored to introduce to you this incredible warrior. Professor Neta Crawford's work contains within it the seeds to bring forth desperately needed changes within our own government and the world. Already an award-winning author, in 2018, she wrote another book, one that VFP members will certainly cherish. Accountability for Killing, Moral Responsibility for Collateral Damage in America's Post-9/11 Wars. That same year, she was the recipient of the Distinguished Scholar Award from the International Ethics Section of International Studies Association. Professor Crawford serves and has served in leadership capacity with many prestigious positions in organizations, including the governing board of the Academic Council of the United Nations System. She regularly appears as a multi-topic expert on radio and television, and she's written numerous scholarly articles appearing in the Naval War College Review and other outlets. She's been published in the Washington Post, the Los Angeles Times, the Boston Globe, and Newsday. As a co-founder of Brown University's Cost of War Project, she heads up a team of 50 experts who publish seminal research on the economic and human costs of US wars. This research has provided the firm footing needed to unmask the US Pentagon as the huge contributor to the crime crisis that it is. Her research on the Pentagon fuel use, climate change, and cost of war research has been foundational to the work of VFP's Climate Crisis and Militarism Project. Thanks to Professor Crawford's work, Veterans for Peace and others can now head into COP26 armed with essential facts. This nation and the world now must face the bitter reality that the United States Department of Defense is the world's largest institutional user of fossil fuels and the world's largest institutional contributor to greenhouse gas emissions. She has given us the tools we need to demand greater transparency from the DoD, and we are doing that. The DoD must do more than green military installations and bases or switch to some electrical vehicles. It's time to switch from war to peace, to switch from controlling the world to cooperating with it. The price of the status quo is extinction of all species, our own included. On behalf of Veterans for Peace, we thank you, Professor Crawford, for arming us for this fight. Now, without further ado, please join me in welcoming one of the most critical voices of our times, the indomitable Professor Neta Crawford. Thank you, Nita.
Hi there. Sorry to be joining you from my car, but I was headed home from dropping my child off at college and too much traffic. Thankfully, I have a partly electric vehicle. So I'm sorry I can't see all of you. I'm really appreciative of the work that you do, Cindy and Garrett and everybody. And thank you for this opportunity. What I want to do is put the Pentagon's fuel use in a longer term perspective and think about our opportunities at this moment. So when you think about war, you think about mobility and also material. In the 19th century, when the United States moved to using coal for steamships, it set off a sort of chain reaction in the sense that then the United States needed to have access to the right kinds of coal. And then if you wanted to travel up further, you needed to be able to have bases for that coal to be stored, and then also to be able to refuel safely. And so they developed ways of refueling in mid-ocean and bases for coal in Asia and in other parts of the Pacific. We got Hawaii, Pearl Harbor as part of that. So coal is really the first fossil fuel that gives us this sort of cycle that the British also were engaged in, where you needed the bases and the relationships with locals so that you could protect access to this thing, which made you more mobile. It was also important for trade. And then obviously when we moved to aircraft and gasoline powered vehicles in World War I and World War II, that consumption dramatically increased. And in World War I and World War II, the US government sort of took over managing all of that, as well as the industrial mobilization. And fuel, as it was in the 19th century and in the world wars in Korea and Vietnam, was essential also for military industry. So there's this great ramp up. And when I talk about the Pentagon's fuel use, I'm also talking about military industry, which is a multiplier of fuel use. So if you think about the Pentagon's fuel use being a factor of 1, then twice as that much is the factor of industrial fuel use. Most of that is now petroleum, but it's still also coal. Both coal and petroleum are high emitters, and be better if we're powering all that with natural gas or renewables. But then, the point isn't necessarily to switch fuels, more efficient fuels to make war. The point maybe is to have less war. But just let me tell you a little bit about the transition that's occurred in the US from the post-Vietnam War era. Obviously, there was a peak of fuel use in World War II and the Korean War and Vietnam. Both of those wars were very aircraft intensive, and aircraft are the biggest users of fuel of the armed services. And then 1975, after the US left Vietnam, fuel use began to decline in the US military. And it went up in the Reagan administration, and then it went down after the end of the Cold War, and was heading down until 9/11, and then it spiked up again. So Pentagon fuel use and emissions, if you track it with the United States surges and the war intensity in Afghanistan and Iraq, what you'll see is that they're very closely tracked. And the United States and its allies also kept or developed new relationships to protect access to oil and bases for refueling. So the post 9/11 wars interrupted a period when the United States was actually decreasing its military fuel use, and we've gone up, and we're just now coming down back to the level where we were in 1999. A few years ago, we reached that level. So why is that important? It's good if we aren't using aircraft as much. They're about 70% of all operational fuel use. And it's even better when, after the Cold War, the United States closed some bases with base realignment and closure, and reduced operations and exercises. So we can, if we continue to build down, and right now I'm so distracted by what's happening in Afghanistan. Maybe I'll say a few words about that. But if we continue to build down then what I think we'll see is declining Pentagon fuel use. It's still enormous, right? It's as large as some countries like Portugal or Morocco or Denmark, larger than Sweden's annual emissions, I believe. So Pentagon annual emissions are still quite high. So that's the first thing. Well, actually, that's two things. The first thing was the way that fuel use leads to overseas commitments to protect access to fuel. The second thing is this tremendous upsurge in fuel use, and then gradual decline, and then it's tracking war. Okay, the third point is what Cindy mentioned, which is this sort of effort to green the military. And it's as if the Marines will become a lean green fighting machine, and they're leading the way. And they are making strides with batteries and other things to actually reduce their fuel use. And of course, they figured this out in 2008 and 2009, and as they went into Afghanistan, and their fuel convoys were attacked, and many tankers were blown up, and people were killed. That if they reduced fuel usage, then fewer people would be killed or injured, and it would be just in general less stressful. So they led the way in innovations like giving people thermostats to regulate temperatures, and developing more efficient mobility. So that is driven by a desire operationally to use less fuel and be less vulnerable. It's not really driven by a concern with climate change. The way the military thinks about climate change, of course, is that it's a threat multiplier. We've heard this now for about a decade, more than a decade. And by that, they mean that the United States will face a more uncertain environment, and uncertainty equals risk. And with the opening of the Arctic, that means that Russia will have access to areas to exploit potentially, but also it means that they still think about this in terms of winners and losers. Some countries will win, like Russia may temporarily for a while be able to grow more wheat in the north. And their losers are countries where there are fires and floods. Okay, so but the other way they think about this as a threat multiplier is that they think that climate change may lead to war. Now, I believe that after looking at this very carefully, the evidence is actually not good that climate change will lead to war. It may lead to conflict, but war is not inevitable. But let's think about the places where it's possible. Between India and Pakistan, both nuclear-powered countries, countries with nuclear weapons, they have a water issue. They have also got an agreement to manage the water. And even though India and Pakistan don't get along, they've managed their water. And they may be able to manage the water disputes between the two. There's a lot of discussion about how when the climate gets worse in the Sahel, the sub-Saharan African countries may go to war over resources. Again, that's not inevitable. And what it turns out, according to the research, to make a big difference is both what I mentioned before, those pre-existing agreements, but also the state capacity, the government's capacity to respond to crises. Now, as we know, you can fritter away your capacity. We see it all the time, but you can also build your capacity in order to prepare for and then respond to crises. So I want to push back against the idea that climate change will inevitably lead to war. What I think we're seeing is the securitization of climate change so that it is part of the drive to perhaps send more resources to the base military budget so that the United States doesn't experience what the other thing that they're worried about, which is climate change overtaking all of the concerns and missions, and the military being sort of turned into like an ambulance system or crisis emergency response, and it taking away from their core warfighting mission. So I believe that we need to think very carefully when we make this connection between climate change and conflict. It's possible and we should work to avoid it, but it's not inevitable. And I want us to think about building capacity. Now, what can the US, that is state capacity, what can the US military do right now? And what would be useful in terms of the Pentagon's emissions? Well, obviously they're interested in adaptation. The focus there is on securing the bases and ports where sea level will rise and where bases will become too hot, and you'll have these red flag days where people can't exercise. They want to adapt to the changing climate, but they could still do much more to reduce their emissions, to mitigate their emissions. And how could this happen rapidly? There's 3 ways, I believe. First way is more base realignment and closure. Second way, to convert immediately the bases that are closed into power generating, green energy generating, solar and wind. Many of these locations have the great capacity for solar and wind. Again, these are marginal, but they're because the United States military is the government's largest emitter. 70% of US government emissions are those that come from the US military. It is still not the United States largest emitter. It's transportation sectors and other sectors as a whole. So all of those activities, like me driving home from dropping my child off to school. So we need to reduce the military's emissions, but let me just really focus on much more important thing, which is military industry. It's abundantly clear that the United States is the world's arsenal. We have been for decades. Most of the US military industries sell most of their weapons to the United States, but they also export a great deal. Most of the largest companies that supply weapons and military equipment to the world are based in the US. What we need to do is decrease conflict so that people buy fewer weapons. We have to make the world more peaceful. And there are many ways to do that. And, that could be another long conversation, but let me just move on to a few other things. And I'm not sure if there's going to be time for conversation. Among other things on this trip, my watch broke and I don't even know how long I've been talking. But let me just talk a little bit about the larger project of the cost of war. When Kathy Lutz and I founded the Cost of War Project in 2010, we were concerned that people not just think about war in terms of dollars, but war means people. It means you can measure the impact of war. You sort of get the big picture by looking at the dollars, but it really is about people. So when I think about the cost of war, it's in the trillions, right? $1 trillion here, $1 trillion there, opportunities lost. But it's also the fact that we spent many hundreds of millions for death annuities for US soldiers, or to provide billions to provide the medical care for veterans. Now, I don't resent paying for veterans medical care. It's, in a sense, it's deferred compensation for the sacrifices that people made. But we haven't paid for it. In fact, we haven't paid for these wars by taxes or by selling war bonds. So what we have is essentially a huge undertaking. I'm calculating for the Cost of War project a number that will be released on September 1st, but it's over $7 trillion total. That it goes for Homeland Security, for veterans care, increases to the Pentagon's base budget because the Congress, in its wisdom, decided the Pentagon needed more money, and obviously war expenses, and then interest on the borrowing to pay for these wars. So that's the big picture, is money spent in this way and not in ways that would have been productive. On September 11, 2001, I knew immediately, living in Boston, when the aircraft stopped flying, that we were going to go to war. And I knew immediately that it was because we're afraid. But what we have done in response out of fear and anger has been this, what, to recall Eisenhower, a theft from the present and the future. I'm very emotional today, thinking about what everybody here knows, which is the tremendous sacrifices that people made to, starting in October 2001, to prosecute the United States war in Afghanistan, and then later the subsequent post 9/11 wars. We're in operations in over 80 countries that are related to counterterrorism. And I'm mindful that even when the United States leaves Afghanistan completely, if it does, we're still operating in more than 80 countries in a global war on terror. And we need to rethink that. We cannot protect everything, everywhere, all the time. And then I just wanted to also recall something that I think about a lot, which is sort of this longer history of the United States using military force. And that is, when the United States goes off to war, whether it's the Revolutionary War, the War of 1812, the US war with Mexico, the Spanish-American War, World War I, World War II, Korea, Vietnam, Panama, and on, not to mention the war with Native people. We always go thinking that it's going to be quick, efficient, effective, that what we do is controllable, that the war ends when it's done. And also we think that it's going to be cheaper than the alternative, which might be sanctions or diplomacy. In almost every case that I've mentioned, those beliefs have been shown to be woefully either ignorant or at least optimistic. When the United States invaded Canada for the War of 1812, we thought this was going to be a cakewalk. It wasn't. Washington, D.C. was burned, as were many towns in Maryland. And we burnt Toronto, then called York. Civilians always suffer. People thought that other wars would be quick. I could go on, but my point is that this is a time to actually make explicit the beliefs that underpin our interest in and over-reliance on the use of force. And that's what I'm trying to do with the Cost of War project. That's what the many people who work on the Cost of War project are trying to do. We're trying to put things in historical perspective, but also bring you the news, which has sadly been disappearing. For instance, And what I mean by disappearing is, for many years, we thought there was a certain number of troops in Afghanistan, then we come to find out, well, that's not the right number. Or for a while now, since February 2020, the Air Force has not been releasing data on its airstrikes. So we don't know how many strikes, dropping how many weapons, and we also don't know other basic facts. So I think that democracy is important. It's fed by information. So along with promoting peace, if we promote democracy, we end up promoting peace, because war and democracy are antipodal. They're antithetical. They don't go together. The more democracy you have, and I mean deliberative, real democracy, where people decide together what it is they want and how to do it, that promoting democracy is a way to promote peace, and promoting war ends up undermining democracy. And that's what we've seen. We've seen an over-reliance on the use of force at home. So with that, I'll stop. I have no idea how long I talked, having lost with my non-functional, beautiful Swiss Army watch. Okay, so if there are questions or comments, I'm happy to participate.
Let's see. Thank you, Nita, for that just excellent class, and for a full understanding about what the cost of war project is, because it's more than dollars. It's lives. It's infrastructure. It's a lot that we lose. So what do we have for questions? Folks want to drop some questions in the Q&A function. I can look through those and maybe we can use some of this time and get some questions out there. So Jim asks, how about lowering DoD's emissions by shrinking the DoD budget?
That's a really good question. There are some people in Europe who've been doing research on this, which is very interesting. They've found that, I did this basic math. I had to do a lot of calculating to get the US DoD's emissions, because it's not published as a sort of thing. What these guys did in Europe was they used a proxy of defense spending as a way to figure out emissions. And they have a pretty good result. So when I check their numbers against my number, it actually works out pretty well. They get pretty close. So what that tells you is, if you reduce defense spending, you can reduce emissions. And it's simply, the case that defense spending enables mobility, and it enables installations. And, of the 800 military installations the United States has, if we reduced some of them, then of course we would be reducing emissions if we reduce spending. Now, what I hear when I brief members of the House and the Senate and their staffs is that people are concerned that to do that means that if you reduce military spending, you're going to reduce the purchase of weapons, and you have to close bases and people lose their jobs. Well, the work of Heidi Peltier and others at the Cost of War Project and economists for many decades shows that when you reduce military spending or a base closes, you don't necessarily lose jobs. In fact, military spending is one of the less productive ways to create jobs. So I think that's not as much of a concern, though I do believe that this idea that, and I should have mentioned this as part of my myths, that the military is good for business is basically one that bears a lot of checking. And in any case, good conversion policies can help.
We've got a question from Janet and Gary Butterfield, both kind of asked similar questions. Why have climate orgs been so reluctant to say anything about militarism and wars and the connection between the two? It's like they live in another world, or is it that the military industrial complex and the DoD is such a fearsome opponent that they don't want to go at it at that angle, maybe?
That's a really good question. I don't know. I suspect it's the same reason why they don't talk about meat, eating meat. They don't want to get away from their core message, right? So we know that, and I'll explain what I mean. Maybe some of you don't understand what I'm saying here, but methane is an incredibly potent greenhouse gas. And what I've been talking about with the military is carbon dioxide, right? That has a factor. Think of that. CO2 is 1. Methane is 24 times as potent as carbon dioxide at heat trapping. And so the biggest emitter of methane is not just the leaky pipes that we have, but it's cows and other ruminant animals which have enteric fermentation, and the things that you do to make the feed for the cows, and the manure processing and so on. So if we want to make a really good impact, then of course we'd stop eating as much meat, right? But the Sierra Club doesn't want to touch that because it's controversial. And we know that Cory Booker was made fun of when he said, you want to take away our hamburgers, when he was asked, what he's a vegetarian, he's a vegan. So he wants to do that for the climate. I think that that's the reason. It's the rally around the flag mentality that makes it seem like you're taking a risk. People fear taking a risk and raising questions, which frankly, that's not their thing. They don't do the analysis of whether or not the United States needs to spend so much of its blood and treasure protecting access to oil. That's not their thing.
Yeah, Greg has an interesting question, and I saw something else in the chat that I want to bring up into this one that Greg brought up. But he says, can you point us to summary of U.S. wars in history and how they never went the way intended, which you touched on, referring to the 1812 conflict. And somebody else wrote in the chat, doing the same thing over and over again, expecting different results is the definition of insanity. But it seems like there's something almost, sinister about, what our intentions are as a nation, as a culture, versus the military industrial complex. And maybe you can merge some of that together.
Mm-hmm. Okay. The history of U.S. wars, I've been working in this field for 40 years. I just read and read and read and read. There's a very good book of Maslowski, I think, and Feiss, which is a history of U.S. wars. I think it's better in a sense than several other histories, because it's not so much it's not promoting a particular kind of interpretation. You can just sort of get some basic facts from there. I think Zinn's book, A People's History, is good. But this is, we've been at war nearly every year of U.S. history, right? And before that, as the United States, before we were even the United States, as colonies against Native people. So there's a lot of history to understand. And the thing that I think has not helped us understanding our history is doing it sort of episode by episode. So we read a book about Vietnam. We think we understand Vietnam, but then you may not get the parallels with previous wars. For instance, the Spanish-American War, and in particular the occupation of the Philippines. There are a lot of parallels there. And you'll remember, perhaps, that during Vietnam, they spoke about Vietnam being Indian country. In the Philippines, there was a very awful phrase where they said, some of the Marines, I believe it was, said, we're going to kill the niggers like Indians. Of course, referring to, putting all the racism in one phrase, referring to the domestic idea of a hierarchy of being and races, but also to their understanding of how it was that they won against Native peoples. And they won against Native peoples by attacking civilians, right? And then you could get the people who wouldn't stand and fight. That's what they said the Native people were doing, to come defend their women and children and elderly. So I think if we read military histories, it's useful to read them over many wars to sort of get the longer term view, and then you'll understand the centrality of civilians. I think there's a lot of other points to that question, and I'm not going to get to them all. I can't remember them anymore.
There's actually a few more questions kind of tying into the military industrial complex.
Right.
So one's just talking about commenting on how the military industry drives the forever wars. And then Chris asked a question just about how Wall Street is getting nasty about fossil fuel investment. It seems like this administration is a little bit more critical about fossil fuel stuff, but there's still this love for the military industry. And is there a way that we can divest from the military industries more?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think it's to remind Congress that there's other more efficient ways to spend money. And when the military tells you that they can, produce a better battery, think about how actually producing that through a civilian industry would be more efficient and maybe better. Recalling that anytime you make a weapon, it has to be one that meets the requirements necessary for extreme environments or for high reliability, that we don't need civilian applications to be that specific, and it is less efficient to spend money getting the military industries or the military to develop applications for greening. So that I wouldn't say that that's a good idea. And then in terms of the larger question about the military industrial complex, I think it's all of us who have these beliefs about war being efficient, effective, controllable, cheaper than the alternatives like sanctions. I think that what military industry does is it tells us we need to have the newest, bestest quickly. So we need an F-35 in an environment where we may not need the F-35. If we turn to making war, a Cold War against China, the reality, then we'll be told that we need all sorts of new weapons and capacities, either modernizing, replacing, doing the military reset, because of the equipment that was used up or damaged in Afghanistan and Iraq. I believe that if we put as much effort into dealing with China in the ways that are less militarized, will make a Cold War less likely. It's not inevitable, and we will spend less money. And we need to have these military industries make things that are as profitable for them, or else we say you don't need to make as much profit. Okay, it's social good that we care about. But I believe that it's all of us in society, and I'm including myself, because when I went to MIT to study making war with all these people who ended up now being, in the Beltway around Washington, D.C. or in the DOD, and we were taught this, that it can be controllable and effective. And, here's how you use nuclear weapons to destroy Moscow. And here's how you make the calculation of how many nuclear weapons you're going to need. we didn't ask the bigger, deeper questions about whether or not force is effective, and whether when wars end, they actually end, and so on. So I think it's a larger conversation about demilitarizing American society than it is just about the military-industrial complex, though I believe, like the people who are asking the questions, that it's an important thing for us to do, which is to focus on getting a different kind of economy that doesn't depend on military contractors or military industries.
Mm-hmm. Oh, Dwight, you got a good question. I'm going to save that one towards the end. Jackie asked an interesting question. You did hit on the fact that the military is using the climate crisis as a way to keep the budget inflated by scaring us into thinking that all these massive wars are coming because of climate change. But obviously, there's going to be some sort of conflicts, which you mentioned. What will the U.S. be involved in because of this climate crisis, because of droughts, loss of access to water, migration, wildfires, population disbursement? I mean, it seems like if one of these nuclear powers becomes a failed state, obviously the U.S. might intervene in that situation. Is there some examples that you might have?
Mm-hmm. Well, in the long run, the United States is in danger of becoming a failed state. Okay, so I'd start there. And that's what the military is concerned about. They're worried that they're going to be the ambulance and the fire truck and the Red Cross all rolled into one. That they're going to have to take up these emergency responses. And in fact, in the wildfires in California, we saw active duty people and reservists being used to fight fires. I think that's the last two major fire seasons. And we have seen, obviously, the United States military deploy to Puerto Rico to help with the response to Maria. And, they did a great job, what they were tasked with doing, which was largely, basically acting like giant contractors. That's A, inefficient, and B, we don't have to go there. If we reduce our emissions immediately, through a combination of individual conversion to getting our schools and hospitals to convert to green energy and planting trees, which is the best carbon reduction technology we have, and decreasing our meat consumption and helping farmers move away from the reliance on cattle, then I think we can get a handle on this, so that the failed state scenario doesn't have to happen. It may well, however, be the case that we're going to move to that, in my daughter's lifetime. Okay, so where are the conflicts likely? Obviously, water is the big one, either too much or too little. So too much water will cause people to move, and we see what happens when people move and they aren't wanted. And then too little water, we may see countries fighting over water. So the United States and Canada, I don't think that this will occur, I hope it doesn't, have huge freshwater resources in the Great Lakes, which they share, Superior, and so on. I grew up on Lake Michigan. It's beautiful, but could we fight over water with our neighbor? That's possible. I don't think that those are conclusions that need to be reached. I don't think that this needs to happen, because it's about preparing and having systems where people feel confident that they're going to work, and then they're less likely to use force out of fear of scarcity, or that things will become so expensive that they can't live comfortably. And that's when I think we use force out of fear and greed.
Well, we have only a few more minutes here, but I want to get to something that Dwight's saying here. You know, I think we need some hope. We need to know where we need to work. Our climate project is working hard on trying to make sure that the military is not exempt from any climate laws that come down the pipe, and that that we're addressing the facts. We're showing up, you know, showing the harm done by the U.S. military that seems to be excluded from a lot of climate conversations. Not only the direct impacts of, you know, the carbon footprint of the military and the use of fossil fuels, but also monopolizing the budget that could be going to solutions and actually protecting extractive colonialism all over the world in the transportation of fossil fuel in so many cases. But, you know, Dwight's direct question is that, you know, the damage that we do through forever war seems impossible to recover from. There are so many issues all across the globe. I get depressed because our task seems so huge and overwhelming. It's too little, too late. Can you give us some emotional support for those who care so much, but feel overwhelmed, and maybe you have some direction for us as we close out here today?
Well, I have a bunch of responses. I used to wake up during the, you know, period between Trump's election and the period of January 22nd, I think it was, with a jolt many nights, because what was happening in our country was so distressing and concerning. But in a lot of ways, what's happening with the climate is much worse. And I don't wake up with that jolt because I feel like there are so many people everywhere, like you, all of you, who are woke, who get it, and are doing their best to contribute to making a better world. You know, for example, I think about how it is that there are all these incentives for us to keep using fossil fuels. What we could demand, not just greater fuel efficiency, but with our automobiles, but that we say to companies, unless you make something that I can use that's, you know, either getting me 100 miles per gallon or is all electric, which with a sufficient range, I'm not going to buy your vehicles anymore. I'm going to buy this other vehicle. So using our economic power. Secondly, I think that it's really healing right now for us to think about planting trees. Okay, that's the best thing we can do. Plant young trees because they absorb carbon more quickly than the older trees. And if you know, are watching the Succession, we realize that I live in Massachusetts. I've got to buy trees now for my little teeny tiny yard that are from a different zone further south, because the trees that we get here up in the north aren't, or not, I'm not even all the way up in the north, but aren't going to do so well with the greater heat. So think ahead and plant trees, and being with trees actually is so healing. So I'm on the Medford Tree Committee, and working with all of these people in my little town of Medford, you know, to the extent that we can work in COVID, is also very good because we're connected. We're doing something positive together, and it's a way for us to, you know, increase democracy at a grassroots level, which I believe is essential. But it's also a way for us to develop the connections that will get us, will give us that social capital that we will need as things get worse, right? And and it's nourishing. Okay, so I believe that yes, it's going to get worse before it stops getting worse, but there are things to do in community. And we have to, as a society, say, you know, war isn't any of those things that we're told: cheap, efficient, effective, controllable, quick. It's none of that. And we have to fight that impulse to want to control everything everywhere all the time, because it gets us into this cycle of uh, fear, reciprocal fear of surprise attack, or and an upward spiral that can't go anywhere good. So I believe that we're working as humans. Many of us are working in ways that are very productive and helpful. And on the days when it's hard and you're concerned, read Yes Magazine, which has all these nice stories about people doing good work everywhere. Now, there are a couple of things that I have done in my life which have just been very satisfying for me on an emotional level and have sort of kept me going. One is right before the lockdown in Massachusetts, I was arrested at the Weymouth compressor station in a direct action. Now, again, that's methane, which is a highly it's a much greater greenhouse gas intensity than carbon dioxide. So I wanted to fight this compressor station. A bunch of us were arrested on the same day. And there's that community that comes in that solidarity of the action. And then I also went to Standing Rock, and I protested there because it was a thing that I felt we had to do. You know, after people were shot at for exercising their voice, and when you were there, it felt like an occupation. I felt it was important not just to be there to put your body on the line, but to be a witness and to talk about how this external militarization that we see with US foreign policy is actually at home. For instance, if you wanted to cross a particular line at Standing Rock, they would inspect your vehicle for water or sleeping bag or food, right? It was as if it was a line, a protected zone, right? So that's a police state to me. That's a very militarized country. So not only were there armored vehicles protecting the pipeline, but the people were dealt with very violently. And the same thing has happened in other locations. I think we need to be there. Regular people, everyday people saying, this matters to me. The time for polite, not being willing to risk arrest, for me, is past. Not that I want to be arrested, but I believe that we have to speak up and stand up. And that also makes me feel better. It's good for me, that engagement and that connection. And, you know, when COVID's done, I look forward to being arrested again if necessary. But I hope I helped with your optimism.
Absolutely. And we'll have members out there getting arrested with you if you invite us out. So thank you so much for spending time with us. Even if you're on the side of the road, frustrated about traffic, I hear you. We are never stuck in traffic. We are traffic. So we got to find solutions. And Nita, you're amazing. I can't wait to take one of your courses someday.
Well, thank you so much for having me. And I'm very, really pleased that you guys do the work that you do.
Thank you.
Keep it up. Thank you so much for all of that.
Cheers. All right, y'all. You know, if you want to get more involved in some of our climate stuff, I know Portland, Oregon chapter's putting on a webinar on climate. Rick and Janet Whale up there are doing that. And you probably saw a link from Cindy up there about, you see, here it is. Yeah, Oh, there's some links coming up. So this is good. Okay. So we've got a lot of good programs around climate coming up, and you can check that stuff out, and you can get involved in the national project. They're meeting all the time. Reach out and get a hold of those folks, and let's get to work. Let's go get arrested. Let's put our bodies on the line. And I think civil disobedience is a power that we have as a people, and we can obstruct and we can get in the way. So just some housekeeping stuff. The recordings for all these sessions can be watched for 30 days after the convention. So you could log back into the convention and you could watch any program that you want that you missed. You could rewatch stuff that you want to take notes on. The chat for those presentations will be available, the chat log. So if you want to go back and look for links or email addresses that were dropped or social media links that are in there, go back in. You can get the chat logs for that, and they should be going up with the links to the shows, so you could see those. After the convention, we'll be sending out an evaluation form asking you how we did. A lot of stuff we want to know is, what's important to you and if you want to get involved and how you want to get involved in improving Veterans for Peace and the work that we're doing. So please take the time and fill out the form. We're going to try to not make it too long this year, so it's not too much of a burden, and get right at the stuff that we need. If you're not a member, become a member. If you are a member, stay engaged. If you're donating, thank you. If you're not, please help support the organization that you're part of. We really do appreciate recurring donations. If you're making a donation, online donation, there's just a checkbox to make a recurring donation. And if you just even imagine everybody that gave $10 a month every month, with 3,000 members, that's a really manageable base budget for us that we can depend on monthly to plan and to expect things. And if you're donating like that as a recurring donor, we make sure that you're not going to lapse on membership dues. We're going to apply that to your membership. So we won't be bugging you about your membership dues if you're a recurring member at $10 or more a month. So we really appreciate that. And, I just want to say thank you to all of the staff of Veterans for Peace. We are blessed as an organization to have so many talented and skilled professionals that are much smarter than I am, and I rely on them every day for advice and ways that we can make things efficient and effective. They're a huge resource for all of you. And they put on an incredible convention. So thank you all for your hard work. And the convention committees, the board of directors, which are all volunteers that get harassed every day to try to do better. We'll make sure they do better, but get involved. We have a really good amount of people that are running for the board of directors. We'll try to do a whole program and invite the nominees out so you can meet them sometime before ballots go out. So get involved in this organization. And for every one of you that is working hard, whether you're a member or not, you're an activist, you're out, you're organizing. Thank you for the hard work you do every day. Please stick around. We've got a really cool drone panel coming up. Brandon Bryant, a buddy of mine who's a whistleblower and former drone operator, is going to be on the panel. And we've got a lot of cool guests there that's going to be talking about the drone warfare, more talk about the protests at Creech Air Force Base about whistleblower protection. And then we have a film, Medicating Normal, that's going to really address over medication, the VA systems, and the recovery of one veteran. And there's a panel attached to that film as well. So if you want to relax and eat some popcorn and watch some movies with us tonight, you can do that. Thanks again. See you at the events, see you in the webinars, and very soon see you out in the streets. Thank you, Veterans for Peace. We'll see you next time.